right around now, they're going to be opening a big Ram temple in Ayodhya. And so this has been, it's been in the works. It's been in the works for a long time. Babur, the first, I mean, I keep asking Drew, but he's just sweating me about it. Yeah, it gets weird if I have to ask you 8 times. It's like if you ask somebody asks for, can I have some more rice? You give them like 4 grains. They go, can I have a little more? And you give them like 2 more grains. At some point, they're just like, all right, he doesn't want to give me rice. There's a big Ram temple opening in Ayodhya, and I think it's this 22nd of January. They did something on Makara Sankranti, and they did something in December. It's been like a month-long celebration. All our devotees are there from India. Devotees from Vrindavan went. We're feeding tens of thousands of pilgrims a day, distributing tons of books. We have a big kirtans going on. The Prime Minister is going to inaugurate the opening. It's a big deal. Huge temple. But there's a bit of a controversy surrounding it because there was a mosque. And in 1992, the Vishwa Hindu Parishad held a big rally and turned violent, and they destroyed the mosque. And so there was a mosque there, and then the mosque was destroyed, and now they're building a Hindu temple there. And if you read newspaper articles, especially in the West, that's how the story's told. Now, I was in India, in Mumbai, in '92 when the riots happened, and it was a big deal. There was a lot of violence, Hindu violence towards Muslims and Muslim violence towards Hindus, and Mumbai being a real melting pot in India, a very cosmopolitan city with just a large Muslim population and Hindu population. It was certain areas were decidedly Muslim. We had to drive through some of them on our way back to the temple, and they're throwing rocks at our vehicle, and we were scared we might get caught there and beaten to death. It was sketchy. And then we got back to the temple, and everything was just shut down for 5 days. We didn't leave the temple. Everything got locked up, and it was touch and go. Anyway, in 1992, in December of 1992, so whatever that is, 32 years ago, the Vishwa Hindu Parishad organized a rally. I think they had like 15,000, 20,000 people show up to protest the mosque. It turned violent, and they broke the temple. And the temple had been built there for 500 years or something like that. Since the 1500s, there'd been a temple there, a mosque there. Now, if you hear that, it sounds like Hindu nationalists destroying a sacred place of the Muslims and then rebuilding a Hindu temple there. And it sounds bad, and that's kind of how the Western media presents it. But there's a little more to the story. So Babur, the first Mughal ruler of India, destroyed a Ram temple at Ramkot in Ayodhya in the 1500s, and then established a mosque there. That was the program for Islam in India. They would go to a Hindu holy place, they would destroy the temple, and then they would build a mosque where the temple stood. And there's, scores of examples of this happening in very important places of worship. I mean, there's a mosque in Mathura at Krishna's birthplace, and they built this mosque in Ayodhya. what's considered to be Ram's birthplace. Ram's Jammabhoomi. I mean, the place is called Ramkot, it's called Ram's Fort, but it's considered to be Ram's birthplace, the place most associated with Ram. And it got bad. I mean, if you read manuscripts from the sultanates in Delhi, but also elsewhere, if you read manuscripts from the Mughal period, Muslims began invading India in the mid-7th century. 636 AD was the first in Thane, near Mumbai. We actually have a temple there. And so that's where they first attacked. And then they also attacked in Gujarat around the same time, and then the incursions became more frequent. They would pull slaves out of India. The estimates are about 100 million slaves were taken from India by Muslims. It's over a long period of time. It's over a long period of time. It's about 1,000 years. Over 1,000 years. It's a long period of time. But those numbers are staggering. You know how many African slaves came to the U.S.? 400,000. 10 million came across the Atlantic Ocean. But the bulk of them, 95% of them, went to Brazil, South America, Haiti, Brazil, South America, Jamaica. I mean, there's a whole, I won't get into the whole history of it, but that was primarily for the plantations there, and the Portuguese were there, and they were big slave owners. In fact, most of the slave traders from Africa were Portuguese slavers. But yeah, only 400,000 made it to the U.S. That eventually swelled to a couple of million because the slaves procreated and had children. And so it wasn't that 400,000 was the maximum amount of slaves in the U.S., but you can compare those numbers to the 100 million people that were enslaved by Islam over a 1,000-year period. And first it was the Persian Empire, and then it was the Afghans and the Mughals. It was just like it was never ending. And that was just one of the things that was done to persecute Hindus by Muslims and their 1,000-year reign of terror in India, which has been described by historians as the bloodiest occupation in the history of the world. Hindus were forced to pay a tax to be Hindus called a jizya, and you could get out of paying a tax if you converted to Islam. There were forced conversions where people were forced to convert. They desecrated temples. They would sometimes take the deities of temples and break them and then use them as the stones to build the steps to the mosque. It's just a way of spitting in the face of Hindus. They wrote about the Hindus have to be regularly humiliated, regularly enslaved, regularly killed, regularly embarrassed, and that's the job of the Muslim occupiers who viewed it as they were spreading Islam through doing this. And how do we know that? Because they wrote about it for 1,000 years in their own texts. There were, sometimes the Akbar stopped the jizya, Aurangzeb reinstated it. It wasn't like, in 1,000 years there were some ebbs and flows that took place. Hindu temples largely were supposed to, according to Sharia law, be in a constant state of disrepair. Aurangzeb enforced Sharia law. You weren't allowed to repair buildings. They'd be desecrated. They were left desecrated. The Hindus had the status of being dhimmis, which was better than an indentured servant, but nothing like a full citizen. Kind of like a prisoner. Dhimmitude was the status of non-Muslims. They were beneath Muslims in society. Muslims were the ruling class. Hindus were low class. And to be a Hindu, you would constantly suffer humiliation and disrespect by Muslims who were, in a caste sense, above you. And why was that done? Because that's what Sharia says you're supposed to do. non-Muslims can never be more than dhimmis. There is no place in the world where Islam committed more violence than in India. There's just no other place in the world. In the Middle East, that was the place of Islam. Okay. But in terms of them going somewhere and establishing Islam through violence, Indonesia wasn't like this. Indonesia is the largest Muslim population in the world. It spread there through trade, peacefully. India was not that. And so Babur, the first Mughal ruler, desecrated the temple of Ram and built a mosque on top of it. How did they know that? Because they had archaeologists go there and excavate it, and they found Hindu structures underneath the mosque, which is what led the... So then this whole thing. So now, Islam ceded control of India to the British East India Company, and then England, and India was under the rule of others for up until recently, up until 1947, when the British finally left post World War II. The Hope Diamond was taken from a deity of Vishnu. Like half the jewels in the British jewel collection were stolen right off of Hindu icons. The British were also awful to the Indians, but the Muslims were worse. But it was further back you go in time, the more people treat each other awfully. I mean, the British were drawing and quartering people. I won't describe what that is, but you can Google it if you want to. Drawing and quartering was a torture execution technique. You tie the person to 4 horses, and they ran off in different directions after you disemboweled them. I guess they just describe it. That was done publicly. That happened. So, starting in the 1800s, Hindus were trying to rise up and re-establish their places, their holy places. And they started fighting over this temple in Ayodhya. So this has been going on for a couple of hundred years, at least 175 years, maybe longer. And in 1949, in December 1949, just in the aftermath of World War II, and just right after India was established as its own sovereign nation in 1947, just a couple of years later, Hindus in the night went into the temple and installed deities of Sita and Ram and began worshiping them in the mosque, which was just, understanding how iconoclastic Muslims are and how much they hate icons unless they are their own. I always thought this was puzzling because Muslims bow down 5 days to a black rock in Mecca. Somehow they don't consider that to be idol worship. But then the icons of every other group, for whatever reason, without any logic or explanation why that black rock is okay to bow down to and worship and go on pilgrimage to and walk around and decorate with tapestries, but every other icon is bad. But anyway, they established Hindu deities, and then they began worshiping them, and that turned into a big fight. And then the country, the government of India, had to take over in 1950. And then things were stalled out, and in 1992 they destroyed the temple, and that pushed things forward. And then they did excavations. They found out, in fact, it was an old temple, and then they eventually passed a law saying you can build a temple there, and then the new temple was built. Beautiful building. And so, temple's opening. There is a controversy. I happened to be in India when the controversy happened in 92, but that wasn't it. It goes all the way back to 1949, goes all the way back to the 1800s, goes all the way back to the 1500s, and then eventually goes all the way back to when the original place was established. Now, it's interesting, but did you know that in Jerusalem, at the Temple Mount, there's a mosque? There's a Wailing Wall, which is one of the walls of the original temple. There's some other holy place there also, but there's the main holy place there is a mosque. And you can look, it's built on top of Jewish structures which were built by Herod. I mean, it's like, thousands of years ago. It's not even up for debate. Like they did the same thing there. They went there, established a holy place there, and built their mosque on the. And you figure, why wouldn't the IDF go in there? Why wouldn't the Israeli government go in there and take over and establish a synagogue? And I have a theory. My theory is because that would be the end of Israel. The IDF does all sorts of crimes against humanity, and really what can only be described as terrorist activities, but that would push Islam too far. And all the work that's been done to establish relationships between Israel and other countries in the Middle East like Saudi Arabia and Egypt would all be out the window, and it would be an all-out jihad. Because it's a holy place for Islam now. There's a story that Muhammad was taken there by the Archangel Gabriel in the night, like on a magic carpet ride, and stayed there and got some special teachings there. So it's considered to be, there's Mecca, there's Medina, and there's Jerusalem, the three most holy places for Islam. And although it's built on top, you just can't, actually, like, non-Muslims aren't allowed to enter except for through one gate, and Muslims are in charge of the place, and it's so that's it's you establish just like there's the Hagia Sophia. You guys know the Hagia Sophia? It's in Istanbul in Turkey. It was the biggest temple in all of Christendom for hundreds and hundreds of years. And then the Muslims took it over and built the Blue Mosque. And then they stopped doing any worship there. And then they reestablished worship there, but they reestablished worship as a mosque, not as the original church, just because it's Turkey, and you definitely would not be able to just make another church there. It'd been too long, it'd been a mosque, and so that was it. So you have to kind of pick where in history you want to draw the line. You can't go all the way back. And so you got to pick where in history you're going to draw the line. And so the Blue Mosque is still a mosque, even though prior to that it was a church. And in Jerusalem, although it's built on top of a synagogue, it's still a mosque. But in Ayodhya, it's a small enough place and sacred enough to Hindus. And now it's because they gave another piece of land to build a mosque. They gave another piece, just some distance away, and then they were given a piece of land by the government. I'm assuming the government even paid for it to build a new mosque for them. And but then they reestablished this place. And so it gets a little dicey because for Hindus, it's just like a great special day, a wonderful day, almost like a fulfillment of prophecy and a reestablishment of what should be, and the removal of something foreign which came in and desecrated a sacred place. It's being brought back to the hands of the devotees that had worship there, and the persecution has finally ended. But then other people don't feel like that. And I do think it's important, just at this point, to make a statement. A lot of times, like Israel will get compared to Hamas. And people who are defending Israel, or the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, the Israeli military, they'll say, oh, but look what Hamas does. We're not worse than Hamas. Hamas is worse than us. The thing is, Hamas is almost universally recognized as a terrorist organization. Israel is a sovereign nation that receives support from the United States of America government, that is internationally recognized, that sits at the UN. You follow? And so just because you can point to a terrorist organization and say they do worse than we do, that doesn't mean that what you're doing is okay, because you're held to a higher standard. Like if the U.S. began enslaving people and said, oh, but there's still slavery in, what's that country called? Mauritania. Yeah, great. I mean, how does that justify what you're doing? And so India is a democratic nation that's on the world stage, that has significant ties to every country of the world that's recognized as a sovereign nation, that's respected as a sovereign nation. And so they have to tread carefully. I lived in India for a number of years. Muslims that represent only, I mean, it's actually far out. You know, India had a woman prime minister in the 60s. We still haven't had a female president. They've had Islamic prime ministers. I mean, it's far out how India is able to like rise up and get stuff done. And be very egalitarian. They have an incredibly aggressive system of affirmative action called the reservation system. It's been around since the 40s when we still were under Jim Crow. When, you know, black people couldn't drink at the same drinking fountain as white people. They were doing incredible affirmative action in the 40s, which goes beyond what we're even doing now. And so in many ways, India is very modern, very democratic. But it's also 85% Hindu. And they're in a post-colonial period where they have finally, after 1,000 years, shed the yoke of rule of Islam and the British in the last century. It hasn't even been a century. And, you know, I mean, you know, Pakistan, when the partition happened in 1947, 13% of the population in Pakistan was Hindu. Now, 1% of the population is Hindu. They just wiped them out. They had to just walk back to India or get murdered. Same thing happened in Bangladesh, which was East Pakistan. In the Bangladeshi war in the early 70s, I think 1970, 71, they also, just this mass exodus of Hindus, just had to give up everything that they had for centuries and walk back to Bengal. And, you know, and along the way, hundreds of thousands of people in Pakistan and in East Pakistan were murdered. And hundreds of thousands more were raped. It was a genocide, twice. Late 40s, early 70s, on either side of India. And so you've got the country of India, which is largely made up of Hindus, and they've suffered tremendous persecution even within my lifetime in Bangladesh, in the lifetime of my parents with Pakistan, and the lifetime of my grandparents with the British rule. And they're trying to figure it out. And so, should the Vishwa Hindu Parishad have destroyed the mosque? No, that was definitely like a religious crime, no question. But then you go back and you start excavating, and you realize, oh, there's a Hindu monument under here, and it's ultra sacred for the Hindus. And it's just one of, hundreds, thousands of mosques for the Muslims. And so they end up getting it back. And it's a happy day. But because I'm also familiar with Western media and Western academia and its coverage of the situation, I was there in '92 and I've been following it since I was 20. I'm aware there's another side of it, of how other people feel hard done by and hurt, and how India's gotten a bad rap. And there's the BJP, I don't want to get too into this, there's the BJP and the RSS, and it's not that there's no Hindutva, and there's no Hindu nationalism in India, and there's no movement towards making India a Hindu state. I mean, it was known as Hindustan by the Muslims, so they kind of, the place of the Hindus, so they kind of named it. There is that movement. And you could say, well, you know, Saudi Arabia is all Muslims. Yeah, but when you're comparing yourself to Saudi Arabia to justify your actions, you've blown it. You don't want to be, if you're a democratic nation, you don't want to come up with a justification for your activities by comparing yourself to, practically speaking, totalitarian regimes in the Middle East. You follow? Just like if you had an indentured servant And then somebody said, this is terrible. You go, no, other people used to own slaves. Like, I just have an indentured servant. I'm not as bad. That's a terrible argument because you're held to a higher standard. So I personally, just for what it's worth, having studied the issue and having followed the issue for the last 30 years of my life, 30 plus years of my life, I think it's a good thing. Had they excavated the building and not found any Hindu structure beneath the mosque, then I don't think they would have a play. They're saying this is Ram's Janmabhoomi, but no one in the history of India thought so enough to build a temple, but you just in the 90s are declaring it, or even in the 1800s, that doesn't count. You don't win that one. But if you can go and show the structure, then yeah, things should be righted. Things should be righted, and it shouldn't be seen as a religious crime. It should just be seen as a restoring. At a certain point in history, you draw a line, like, okay, 800, like with Hagia Sophia. It used to be a Christian temple, but it was a mosque for 500 years, so okay, it's a mosque forever. Like at a certain point, or there's a practical concern, like in Jerusalem, where if they were to try to, it happens every so often, a bunch of Jewish people will break in to the Temple Mount complex and start doing their prayers in front of the mosque. And it gets super tense. And the police have to come in and pull everybody out. A couple of years ago, they cut the speakers for the call to prayer while they were making the call to prayer. And so stuff happens. It's a super hotbed. And so sometimes it might be just you can't do it politically. It's too dangerous. Like if, for instance, instead of there being whatever, there's a couple tens of thousands of Muslims living in that village. If it was instead there was 5 million Muslims living in a major city and that was their holy place, then you might have to deal with it differently. But that wasn't the case. They could make this move super sacred to Hindus, not so sacred to Muslims. They gave them another piece of land. They found the structure underneath. There was a little bit of bad stuff from the Vishwa Hindu Parishad. A couple of centuries had been on trying to get this place back. And now it's back, and it's a temple for Ram. It's a good thing. But now you guys know the history of the place. Raise your hand if you already knew all this history. You knew all this history? You? Really?
I mean, only from the Bible, like he did, but not maybe in as much detail as you do.
Well, all this history means everything I just said. Not because if you say I didn't know all this history, but I knew this history, that could mean you knew one sentence. Did you know most of this? You knew most of it? You knew most of it? Just little pieces, right? You knew most of it? Because you studied it, right? No, you just know it?
The European stuff, I know because the European Middle Eastern stuff, I've studied it. And then my dad was telling me all about it.
Okay, all right. I wanted you guys to have a full understanding of the subject. And so we haven't done everything, but we at least touched on the basics of it. And then I thought the other thing we would do today is we would look at a verse in the Ramayana, the text most associated with Ram. There's other texts that are sacred that involve Ram, but this is a verse from the Ramayana, and it's a verse which shows up in our sacred text. It's in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, and it's in the Hadi Bhakti Vilas, two very important texts from our tradition from the medieval period, about 500 years old each. And they both quote this verse. It's a beautiful verse, and it's a verse on bhakti from the Ramayana. And it's used, actually, as part of our definition of bhakti. In other words, when our theologians 5 centuries ago were writing down very, very exact definitions of bhakti, and they were quoting from the voluminous Vedic literatures to establish precedents for what they were teaching, this verse was selected as one of the proofs, as one of the pieces of evidence that was cited so that you'd be able to appreciate what they were trying to say. Let me say that again. 5 centuries ago, during a revival, a bhakti revival movement in our tradition, our theologians wrote down very clean and comprehensive definitions of bhakti. Now, the fact that they wrote them down in Sanskrit meant that there needed to be something written. You couldn't just pull a verse from a text that was already there. They wanted to really exactingly and comprehensively define bhakti for all time. And when they did that, because Hinduism is the oldest continually practiced religion in the world, one of the things they have to do is they have to demonstrate that what they're saying isn't new, but it's authoritative, and it's what was being taught centuries and millennia prior by our teachers millennia ago. They have to show that. Otherwise, they're making a new religion. They have to show that what they're saying is orthodox. And the way they do that is they show the texts that they're building their definition on so that you can see their bona fides and that they're legitimate. Just like to establish that there should be a Ram temple built, you had to find the substrate, that it was a Hindu temple. So we have to do that to prove what we're saying isn't just new, it's not just coming from nowhere, this is our tradition. At the same time, as they're writing down the definitions, they're being informed by these ancient texts, and they're in many ways compiling them. One of the verses about these theologians, a piece of poetry, said, Nana Shastra Vicharanaika Nipuno Sat Dharma Samstapakao, that they deliberated on unlimited numbers of shastras. Nana Shastra, many shastras. Vicharanaika Nipuno, they were geniuses at deliberating on the meaning of many different shastras. And that Sat Dharma Samstapako, they established eternal Dharma by looking carefully at them. And so this is one of the texts that informed their definition, but it's also one of the texts that was given as evidence for the bona fide of their definition. Sakrid eva prapano yaha. Yaha, one who, prapana. Prapana means approaches me, from prapad, steps towards me, but prapana has come to mean one who falls down before me, steps towards me, prostrates himself in front of me, supplicates in front of me, one who approaches me in a mood of surrender. Sakrid eva prapana yas, one who approaches me, who surrenders to me. Sakrid, one time. Sakrid eva, just one time if someone approaches me, surrenders to me. Tavasmiti cha yachate. And they say, Tavasmi. Tavasmiti. Iti means quotation marks here. So they say, quotation marks, Tavasmi. Tava means yours. Asmi means I am. You put them together and it becomes Tavasmi. Say it with me. Tavasmi. 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 If someone approaches me one time and says, I'm yours. Now, tavasmi is interesting because the term is used in Manu, the Manavadharma Shastras. Prior to a few hundred years ago, there was no separation of church and state, and so religious texts were also legal texts. At that time in India, the Manu Samhita, more properly known as the Manavadharma Shastra, was the major legal text of ancient India. Military surrender, one of the definitions of military surrender is you say, Tavasmi, I'm yours. It means I'm yours. This is also, you make Kritanjali, this with your palms, Kritanjali. Like this, we say in the West, put your hands up. No, I'm not saying put your hands up. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I didn't say Simon Says. So, in the West, people will tell you to put your hands up to indicate surrender. In India, you do this. It's the same idea. So this Kritanjali mudra is the mudra. That means I'm surrendering. And saying a verbalization, Tavasmi, means I'm surrendering. And it means the person can no longer kill you, has to give you protection. And the Geneva Convention and the rules of war and how to deal with prisoners of war comes into effect. And so that's the definition which is chosen. So, Sakrideva prapano yas, tavasmiti cha yachate. If one of a person, this is Ram speaking, God speaking. It's a religious text. Ram is God, God is speaking. This is a religious statement by God. If a person one time approaches me and says, I'm yours, then abhayam sarvada tasmai dadami etad vratam mama. Etad vratam mama. This is my vow. So God is making a vow to us. And it's a conditional statement. If you do this, then I will do this. So it's an if-then statement, what's called in English a conditional statement. And so I'm making this vow. Eta, this, mama bratam, this is my vow. This is my brat. This is my vow. Sakradeva prapanas yaha tavasmiti cha yachate. If you approach me one time and say, I am yours, then abhayam sarvada tasmai dadami. I will give you. I will give unto you. Tasmai means unto you. Dadami, I will give. Abhayam sarvada. I will give you in all circumstances fearlessness. Bhaya means fear. Abhaya means non-fear. Abhayam sarvada means you're fearless in all circumstances. Dadami, I will give that to you. Tasmai, unto you. Etad mama pratam, that's my vow. And all you have to do is sakrid one time, prapana. You have to approach me, and yachate, you have to say, you have to pray, tavasmi. What a great verse. What an epic verse, thousands of years ago. That really, what do I want to say, encapsulates bhakti. And amazingly, the military-esque language is not a deficiency. Sometimes like in gospel music, kind of what used to be called black spirituals, they would talk about sweet surrender. You know, when you get into oppressed people, religion oftentimes becomes the one thing that can't be taken away from them. It's almost the last vestige of human freedom. And so people might control your life, even control your body, but they can't control your mind. And so within religion, people have always, especially oppressed people, have always found freedom. The statement, the kingdom of God is within, it has actually deep import. Because there are many times in your life where you won't be able to control the exteriors, but you can control the interiors. That's the only thing you're left you can control. That's from the work of Viktor Frankl, who survived Auschwitz, where his whole family was murdered. And he realized this in Auschwitz and wrote about it. In a book called Man's Search for Meaning. A very popular book. Many people, probably people in this room have read it. He called it the last vestige of human freedom. That nobody could take it away from you, no matter what they do. And they can't take away how you choose to react to life and what you choose to do on the inside. So you find in these gospel hymns and religious music this idea of the sweet surrender. That when you surrender to God, when you supplicate before the deity, when you give your heart to Krishna, you become fearless because you felt like you're being held in the hand of God, and the world becomes a less scary place. And so this statement, Ram's statement, I will give you fearlessness, it really kind of gets to the heart of why people within spiritual movements have turned to divinity, to an all-good, all-powerful deity, and found peace even in the most trying of times, even in the most difficult of circumstances. And so although that is, I think, is a very well-evidenced and very logical and very reasonable, and really gets to the heart of religion, to see it so expertly explained and utilized thousands of years ago in our text warms my heart, gives me great faith. That just one time you approach Krishna, you approach Ram, you say, I'm yours. That military thing that seems like a bad thing, like I'm surrendering, now I don't have my freedom. No, because if you approach, sometimes you need to surrender. To a doctor, you say, what advice do you have for me? Can you help me? I can't help myself. I need your help. Sometimes that's the appropriate thing to do. is to trust somebody else and give yourself over to somebody else. That's the most intelligent thing to do. Like a fireman. Just lay down. I'll carry you. Like your legs are broken. You're in a fire. Just lay down. Let me pick you up. Like, should I help you? No. You're just going to mess it up. You can't just pick somebody up. Like in the movies, like pick up a unconscious person. It's actually impossible to do. Try it sometime. Can't pick anybody up. Absolutely impossible. What you have to do, you have to roll over them. You have to roll over them. Like physically lay down and somersault over them and gather them up. And then you gather them up and then you can wind up in a squatted position with them on your back. But otherwise it's like trying to pick up Jell-O. It's just like you can't like actually pick up another person. I've learned the technique. Like, so if any of you get knocked unconscious and the building's burning down, I can at least pick up a couple of you. But you're helping me, like, and it's just going to get weird. Like, I know how to do it. I know how to somersault. But you start, like, picking your leg up, I'll, like, fall on your leg and get impaled, and it'll be a bad day. And so sometimes that's like you got to, like, let go and let God. And even if that's not what you're doing physically, that should be there in your heart. And so this sweet surrender and the military-esque language, I don't see as a deficiency. I actually see it as an ornament of the verse. It's able to use language which is normally used militarily, but use it in a way which really gets to the heart of a much larger issue, namely humanity's relationship with the deity. So I thought it would be appropriate to mine from our tradition a text, to look at it, and also to give you guys some background so you could better appreciate what's happening, like literally right now. It's on the 22nd, which is India's 12 hours ahead, so it's right now it's happening in India. And some of the background of it in case you hear different points of view. And I guess I'll just finish with this. I'm not just like a Hindutva person, where just because you're Hindu, then it means whatever you do is okay. Just because other people do bad stuff doesn't mean we can do slightly less bad stuff and hold our heads up high. We have to embody the beauty and the grace and the generosity and the egalitarianism and the tolerance of our tradition. And it's just what it is. And the fact that other people did bad stuff a long time ago or even recently doesn't justify you doing bad stuff today just because it's slightly less bad than what they did or even a lot less bad than what they did. We need to be able to take our actions and measure them up against an objective standard, a reasonable standard, a good standard, a moral standard, like a high ethic, and show it's good. And for me, the fact that not that the Vishwa Hindu Parishad broke the temple down, not that some Hindu zealots ran in there and established a temple of Ram, not that they've been trying to do this for a couple hundred years, not that India's in the majority, not that Saudi Arabia has their own Sharia in their nation, and not that India is breaking free from the yoke of colonialism so they can do any damn thing they want to now. None of that. But when they stepped in, they excavated, they found out that there was a pre-existing Hindu temple which had been razed, desecrated, turned into a mosque to spit in the face of all the Hindus who venerated that place. And it was appropriate to fix it, and it could be done, and so they did it. I think it's a good thing. I think it was a clean, it was well played. I think the Indian government did good on this one. And I think it was great that they gave land to the Muslims to build a mosque elsewhere, and that, in fact, I think they paid for it as well. I think that's also good. I appreciate that also. And from my time in India, I saw Hindus and Muslims always lived in relative peace, which is surprising because the two traditions have such a history of, it's like it's so bad, the history between them. You follow? It's so bad, the history between them. So much abuse was there. Like I said, from the Muslims towards the Hindus, 99.99%, literally. But and the fact that they can still live together in relative peace, and I'm always really proud that happens in India. You don't see it happening in other countries. In Bangladesh, in Pakistan, you don't see it happening. So I feel good about this. I'm excited. The temple looks beautiful. The devotees are there. Big kirtans going on. We're feeding tens of thousands of pilgrims a day. And we're doing something similar in the U.S. right now. I don't know if you're aware of this. You may be, you may not be. But there's a bunch of Confederate memorials, especially in the South in the U.S., like Robert E. Lee High School, and like statues of Confederate generals. And there's been a gradual movement towards changing the names of those schools and removing those memorials because it's so offensive to the black community and actually to everybody who is familiar with the history, but especially to the people who suffered under that yoke. And so it just, and then there's always a complaint. Now, I went to this high school, and it's been named that high school for hundreds of years, and there's so much beauty in the Confederate flag, and it means so much to me personally. And it's like, yeah, okay, but if we compare what it means to you personally versus the atrocities which were done to this community and how triggering it is for them, they win. You follow? And so we're actually going through this in the U.S. now. And that's kind of what happened here. It's a little more complicated because they would say that the mosque represents, something very sacred to them. It starts to get into your religious freedoms. But it was an atrocity which was committed against a community a few hundred years ago. The numbers of Hindus which were killed by Muslims, including slavery and everything else, it's north of 200 million people. It's the largest genocide in the history of the world. You can take the 20 million people Mao killed, the 20 million Russians that died in World War II, the 10 million people that Hitler killed, the 20 million Mao lost in the Great Leap Forward when he centralized farming, Pol Pot, the 3 million people he killed, and multiply that number by 3. It was the largest genocide in the history of the world. And I think it's good that some Hindu places come back to the Hindus. Maybe not every place. I mean, I've been waiting for them to build they remove the mosque from Krishna's birthplace. That disturbs me whenever I go there. Maybe they won't all come back. Maybe they shouldn't all come back. Maybe some of those places have been too long and you need to let things go. But I think this was good. I think it was healthy. I think it was appropriate. Thank you very much. Let's do a look at time.